Reporting on the Michael Cohen investigation has uncovered more about the strange relationship between Donald Trump and the sensationalist tabloid The National Enquirer. The Washington Post revealing that, quote, during the presidential campaign, National Enquirer executives sent digital copies of the tabloid's articles and cover images related to Donald Trump and his political opponents to Trump's attorney, Michael Cohen, in advance of publication. While the Enquirer's parent company, American Media, has denied the practice, Trump is known to be close with the company's CEO, David Pecker. The tabloid frequently attacked Trump's opponents, often with unverified or specious headlines, many of them aimed at Hillary Clinton. Post also reports that, quote, Trump suggested stories to Pecker on a regular basis and was particularly interested in stories about Clinton's health. However, the Enquirer is probably best remembered for printing unsubstantiated stories about Ted Cruz, including allegations of marital infidelity and the baseless claim that Cruz's father worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Kennedy assassination. Trump spread those stories to bash his Republican rival, all while claiming he had nothing to do with the tabloid behind the allegations. Let's watch.
I had nothing to do with it. The campaign had absolutely nothing to do with it. He's got a problem with the National Enquirer. I have no control over the National Enquirer. I didn't even know about the story.
On the cover of the National Enquirer, there was a picture of him and crazy Lee Harvey Oswald having breakfast. Now, Ted never denied that it was his father.
What was he doing with Lee Harvey Oswald shortly before the death, before the shooting? It's horrible.
But there was a picture on the front page of the National Enquirer, which does have credibility.
It's up to people to believe it or not to believe it. I'm not writing it myself. I'm not going out and doing the research.
I mean, if that was the New York Times, they would have gotten Pulitzer Prizes for their reporting.
And I'm joined now by the author of that report, Sarah Ellison from the Washington Post, and John Podhoretz is the editor of Commentary Magazine and an MSNBC contributor. And Sarah, let me just start with you just to sort of fill in some of the blanks. I think we gave you kind of the basics there, but take us through this relationship between the Trump campaign and the Enquirer. What did that look like behind the scenes? What did that result in for the world to see?
Well, we've known for a long time that Donald Trump and David Pecker, who is the CEO of American Media, are friendly and friends, and they've communicated a lot over the years. That's fine. People are allowed to have those kinds of friendships. What we were specifically reporting on, well, I guess the other thing that we actually know is that the National Enquirer gave a lot of very positive coverage to Donald Trump and a lot of very negative coverage to his opponents. Why did that happen? How did that develop? That was one of the things that we were sort of interested in figuring out. And in my reporting, what I found when I was talking to people was that there were actual stories that were sent prior to publication over to Michael Cohen with the express purpose of making sure that they were okay with him.
And does this, is this, because we heard so much here in New York, Donald Trump and gossip columnists at the New York City, is this like a similar thing where Trump the celebrity, Trump the Apprentice star has a relationship with the celebrity tabloid and that just folds into the campaign? Is that kind of what happened here?
Well, I think that that's one way to think about it, right? It's totally acceptable for a celebrity or a reality star or someone who is a New York real estate developer to make lots of calls to gossip columnists and want to be a source for lots of information. The rules change a little bit when you're a candidate. You still can talk to as many publications as you want. You can suggest stories. You can, there's nothing about that that's problematic. The issue becomes one, and this is sort of what the investigators are looking at, is the National Enquirer sort of an extension of is a part of a campaign apparatus? Is there a level of control that this politician or his campaign might have over this publication?
And John, let's talk about the impact, if there is any. I'm curious what you make of it, because what these stories, use the Ted Cruz one as an example. The National Enquirer puts it out there, and Donald Trump's able to get up there on TV or at rallies and say, hey, did you see this? I've read this. People are talking about this story. It's out there. And he could say, hey, the National Enquirer is credible. It gave him an excuse to talk about this in public. Do you think things like that ended up having an impact on the election?
And they might have had a minimal impact on the primaries. I don't know what impact they had on the election. The idea that the National Enquirer is beholden to the rules of proper journalistic conduct is a little preposterous. It is a publication that has for 50 years done nothing but violate every journalistic rule in the playbook, and so the notion that it it did not hold itself to a proper standard of mainstream conduct is something that I think everybody understood during 2016 who was paying attention. I think more interestingly is what the relationship between Trump and the Inquirer shows in larger picture about how he got elected. Trump began his political life in this modern frame around 2010, 2011, at the tutelage of his consigliere, Roger Stone, who introduced him to Art Bell and Alex Jones of InfoWars, and he was deep into the World Wrestling Federation, into talk radio all over the country, and what we might call, and the Inquirer, what we might call a kind of proletarian media that was almost entirely invisible to the mainstream media types like us. And by the time he began running for office, in 2015, he had built up a very large following among people who have gone totally ignored in the electoral process, and I think jump-started his way into the lead in the Republican primaries precisely because he had been so carefully cultivating that world and that audience that we paid no attention to.
I think that's a fascinating point because, right, the average National Enquirer cover story does not make its way onto MSNBC or CNN, New York Times, any of these places, and yet there every day of the week, millions of Americans at the checkout line in the supermarket are at least seeing the cover, maybe picking it up, maybe buying it, who knows. There is an exposure there that you might not see through the coverage, and it leads to another question, too, which is you look at Donald Trump and just his history in New York, the stuff that's been reported, the stuff that he's bragged about in some cases, and you say this is a guy who would be rich fodder for a tabloid like the National Enquirer, and yet in 2016, that's not necessarily how the coverage read.
No, indeed not. I mean, this, in terms of the small tragedy that the National Enquirer is passing up a very rich topic, they certainly are doing that with the Trump family and Donald Trump. He would be a perfect sort of person to be covering. I do think that the notion that this is a part of the world that MSNBC doesn't pay any attention to, the Washington Post doesn't really pay attention to, that it can pass sort of unnoticed, and yet it's everywhere in parts of the country where people are developing their impressions as they say, I don't know, I mean, Hillary Clinton, it just seems like her health isn't that great. Or Ben Carson, I've just heard he's not that good a surgeon, or these kinds of things that, where'd you hear that? I don't know. I do think there is a level, I mean, we sort of scoff at the National Enquirer, but I do think there is this, it's a way of putting something into the ether.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.